This is Charles Goyette. Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Okay, welcome back to Butler on Business. Jason, would you please introduce our next guest?
Peter Ferrara is the Senior Fellow for Entitlement and Budget Policy at the Heartland Institute and Director of Policy for the Carlson Center for Public Policy. He served in the White House Office of Policy Development under President Reagan and as Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States under First President Bush. He is the author of America's Ticking Bankruptcy Bomb, now available from HarperCollins.
Peter, thank you for joining us today on Butler on Business.
Glad to be here.
Peter, how does the supply-side economics under Reagan mesh with the Austrian economic theory?
Well, this follows, Austrian economics exactly, because this is exactly what Austrian economics says. Once the Fed pumps up the money supply, it creates malinvestment. And when the Fed stops doing that, the malinvestments are revealed. And those, so then you get a recession. And so you have to go through the recession and let the malinvestments be liquidated to get out of it. But if the politicians don't want to go through the recession and they keep going back to printing up the money again, well, eventually they're going to completely trash the dollar on that course. So, the only way out is entirely new national leadership that is going to reestablish the principles of Reaganomics. Ronald Reagan gave a famous speech in 1975 at the Conservative Political Action Conference. And he said, what is the role of future for conservatives? Do we go start our own third party and divide up the vote, or do we take over the Republican Party? And he gave an impassioned, famous speech, 1975 at CPAC, arguing that the conservatives, the free market libertarians, need to take over the Republican Party. As my discussion indicates, the margin for error for America now is much less than it was even in the 1970s. We're talking a huge crash scenario here unless the people wake up and get out there and dramatically change our leadership.
We stay on top of the real economic statistics. Every time they publish something, a couple days later, we've digested it. So I know that we've got an inflation rate. If you go back to the Reagan-era methodology for counting inflation, which is what they did when they were actually trying to accurately reflect the cost to maintain a fixed standard of living, that is now above 10%. And once you tally the real rate of inflation and compare that to that mythical GDP number, rather than growing, it actually contracted. Our position, Jason and I, is that we're already in this second dip of this recession, and unless we change course rather dramatically, rather quickly, we're going to slip back into a depression. And I will caution everybody and tell them now, before you get fearful of the D word, that was a contraction of 10% or more. So if you go back to the trough of the second quarter based on those benchmark adjustments by the BEA, we actually hit for one quarter a depression this time around. But I think this next one is going to be much worse. What is your spin on what I just said?
Well, I think that's a very fair appraisal. But even with the current numbers as published, America is in deep trouble. I was talking about the national debt before, and how it's going to soar past the all-time record during World War II, and then soar past a level that triggered bankruptcy for Greece. But the national debt does not nearly encompass everything the federal government owes. You have all the unfunded liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The government has played so many games with its books that it can't even calculate the unfunded liability. But the best measure of it, best estimate of it, that you can glean from government reports is over $100 trillion. So when they say that unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare are over $100 trillion, that's 7 years of everything we produce to cover the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. And then there's, on top of that, there's federal civil service retirement, unfunded liability, federal military pensions, unfunded liability, veterans benefits, unfunded liability. We have the FDIC deposit insurance for insured deposits, FHA home mortgage insurance, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and none of this is included in the national debt. Now, if you look even just at the current deficit, That's the highest in world history by far. The highest during Reagan's years, when there was so much yelling and screaming about the deficit, was $221 billion. Yes, things were, under the first Republican majorities in the 1990s, when Gingrich was Speaker, the federal spending as a percent of GDP was actually reduced by 1/7 because it did come in the first majorities and did cut spending and restrain the growth. But after Gingrich left, when Bush took over as president, they increased federal spending as a percent of GDP under President Bush by about the same 1/7 that Gingrich and the Republicans initially cut it by. So again, you have this concept of two Republican parties there and the battle for the Republican Party. But the problem is Obama came in and just went into overdrive. He went into overdrive, and he basically multiplied several times everything Bush was doing wrong. So he dramatically increased spending as well. As you mentioned before, spending for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and the welfare programs are going to consume 95% of all federal revenues. So there's not even enough money left there to pay interest on the national debt. All the money for everything else the federal government does, national defense, law enforcement, transportation, agriculture, every cabinet department outside these entitlements, all of that is going to have to be borrowed. So even with the numbers that we have today, the problem is, virtually insurmountable. Now we have on the horizon what I discussed before, which is that he may, in fact, have the economy scheduled for a huge collapse with all those across-the-board tax rate increases that I discussed, with the Fed basically reaching the point where, if they don't cut back on the printing presses, they're going to create runaway inflation. If they cut back, that's going to cause a downturn. That will produce cutting. The Fed tightens monetary policy. That will raise interest rates. That contributes to the downturn. You have the energy policies of the administration, effectively another huge tax increase on the economy. What EPA is doing with its cap-and-trade policies is adding, will add eventually well over $1 trillion in costs to the economy on top of everything else. You put all those things coming together is a wicked collapse, double-dip recession. And when you have a recession on top of that, that will cause a further explosion of the deficit, and we will be just like Greece at that point. But it gets another turn of the dial to make it worse, because we financed World War II by running up our national debt to 109% of GDP. When we're already on course to soar past that, how are we going to defend the country if we face another military challenge? Where are we going to get the money if we have to fight a war on top of that? And our potential enemies know that. They see that. They're not going to be oblivious to our military vulnerability at that point. So even if they don't attack America, all of our allies are subject to being attacked at that point. Israel attacked by Iran, South Korea attacked by North Korea, Taiwan attacked by China, Ukraine attacked by Russia. And how do we respond to this stuff when, the military will say, well, where are we even going to get the money to pay for the gas to respond to these military challenges, let alone, some kind of attack on the United States itself? And so this is the enormous danger that America is in at this point.
Peter, we'll have to end it right there because we are out of time. You are listening to Butler on Business, and we'll return shortly.